The Assistant Minority Leader.
Mr. President, how much time is remaining on the Democratic side?
9 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me commend my colleagues, Senator Nelson, Florida, Senator Stabenow, Michigan, for their statements. Senator Nelson spoke from the heart and spoke for many of us on both sides of the aisle who feel that this letter sent by 47 senators really undermines the efforts of the President of the United States to avoid a nuclear Iran and to avoid a military response. And I particularly want to thank my colleague, Senator Stabenow from Michigan, for recalling that moment in history, which any student of the Senate knows was something that made a difference in the foreign policy of the United States of America for 70 years. It's seldom that any of us come to the floor and think that our speeches will be remembered for 70 minutes. But 70 years later, Arthur Vandenberg, Republican of Michigan, set a standard for foreign policy which has really guided our country since. At a time of deep political division after World War II, this self-described isolationist and extremely conservative enemy of the New Deal stood up and called for unity when it comes to foreign policy. And his admonition that politics should stop at the water's edge has largely guided us. And when you look at all the controversies that have ensued since then, think of the Vietnam War and what was going on in this body during that war. The deep divisions between Democrats and Republicans, those who were against the war and for the war, and yet there was never, ever anything like we've seen with this letter sent by 47 Republican senators. I'm glad that that didn't occur then, even though I had deep misgivings and trouble with the Vietnam War and its execution. I would have had to be, I guess, reckless to endorse an idea that our nation, through its Senate, would reach out to the Vietnamese during the course of that war when so many lives were at stake and so many lives were lost. So here we are today, a letter sent by 47 Republican senators. We've talked about the impact of that, senators. Reflect for a moment the impact of that letter on our allies who were sitting at the table in Geneva, our allies who joined us in imposing the strictest sanctions in history on Iran to force them into negotiation, our allies sitting with Secretary Kerry and representatives of our government who must look at this letter from 47 Republicans and say, why are we wasting our time? What they're saying is no matter what we do, because no agreement's been announced, no matter what we do, the Republican Senate is going to reject it. That's what the letter says. It goes on to say, and this is a little bit of chutzpah according to the New York Times, the senators signing the letter go on to remind the Ayatollah, who is not term limited, that they have 6-year terms and may be around for decades. Decades. Basically saying to the Iranians, don't even waste your time thinking about negotiating. Well, it's not a waste of time, because the alternatives are absolutely horrifying. The alternative of a nuclear Iran would be a threat not only to the nation of Israel and many other Middle Eastern states and countries beyond in Europe and other places, but it would invite a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And the ending is totally unacceptable and unpredictable. So is it worth negotiating? Is it worth trying to find a way to avoid a nuclear Iran? Of course it is. And should the negotiations fail, and they might, I hope not because of this letter, but they might, then what do we face? Bringing Iran to its knees with more sanctions? And who will we call on for these sanctions? Who will we turn to and say, will you join us in a more strict sanctions regime? The very same allies who sat at this table and saw this letter from 47 Republican senators saying to them, don't waste your time. We have the last word when it comes to Iran. I don't believe the Republican leadership was thinking clearly when they signed onto this letter. I don't think they understood the gravity of their action. They certainly were premature at the minimum. We don't have an agreement. We are days away from understanding whether there's a possibility of an agreement. And yet, these 47 senators have basically said, don't waste your time. We're not going to accept it, no matter what it is. This, Mr. President, is a sad outcome. Like Senator from Michigan, I was one of 23 who voted against the invasion of Iraq. I never dreamed 1 minute of sending a letter to Saddam Hussein before that vote, instructing him about the politics of America. And it turns out that in the history of the Senate, that has rarely, if ever, occurred. I hope now that those 47 Republican senators will reflect on their actions and reflect on the impact that it'll have. I hope that the American people understand the president is embarking on a very difficult and delicate mission to try to negotiate a verifiable end to the nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and specifically to end nuclear capability in Iran. He may not achieve it, but I respect him for trying. He is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America. He is the elected leader of our nation. And though many cannot accept it here in this chamber, he is the President of the United States, and he deserves our respect. I respected President George W. Bush even when I disagreed with him on his policies in Iraq, and we should expect nothing less of the loyal minority when it comes to this president as well. Mr. President, I conclude by saying the Senate has an important role to play. But the president's role, speaking for the United States, trying to avoid a nuclear Iran, trying to avoid a military conflict, another war in the Middle East, is something that should not be undermined for political ambition. I yield the floor.